At 5:40 in the evening on July 1, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt picked up the telephone inside his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a grand chateau west of Paris that had once echoed with the footsteps of French royalty, where the warm summer light slanted through tall windows and illuminated wall-sized maps crowded with red and blue markings describing the collapsing German positions in Normandy. On the other end of the crackling line was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, calling from the Wolf's Lair in the deep forests of East Prussia, over 1,000 miles away, demanding, on Hitler's behalf, to know the situation, his voice carrying the tremor of a man who knew he must present whatever truth he received to a leader who no longer tolerated reality. 25 days had passed since the Allied landings on June 6. The Americans had just captured Cherbourg, the deep-water port that would soon funnel supplies into France at industrial scale. The British were grinding toward Cannes in fighting so ferocious it seemed to consume entire battalions at a time. German casualties, killed, wounded, missing, captured, had mounted so high that several divisions existed only on paper. Replacements were not arriving. The Luftwaffe could not contest the skies, and the once proud Western Front was being eaten away inch by inch. Keitel repeated the question Hitler had been asking for weeks. What should we do? Von Rundstedt, 68 years old, senior field marshal of the German army, a man who had served under 3 governments and studied war for half a century, paused as the line hissed with static, then answered with the clarity of a man who had exhausted all patience. End the war, you idiots. What else can you do? On the other end, silence, because Keitel knew it was true, and because truth had become the one thing no one dared speak aloud to Hitler. Within days, von Rundstedt was dismissed, replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who, despite his competence, could no more reverse the tide than von Rundstedt had. The war would continue another 10 months, millions more would die, Germany's cities would be flattened, and the Red Army would reach Berlin in a storm of vengeance, while the man who had spoken plainly would watch from forced retirement as his predictions unfolded exactly as he had foreseen. To understand why von Rundstedt said what he said, and why it cost him his command, one must understand what he had been observing since the spring of 1944, and what kind of man he was. Born December 12, 1875, into a Prussian military family whose lineage traced back through generations of officers, he entered the army at 16, served competently through World War I, rising through staff positions that taught him the art of managing huge formations, coordinating artillery and infantry, and sustaining logistics across hundreds of miles. After 1918, he remained in the small Versailles Limited Reichswehr, rising quietly but steadily. By the time Hitler seized power in 1933, von Rundstedt was already one of the army's most senior officers, a representative of the old Prussian military aristocracy that viewed Hitler with a mix of professional distance and cultural disdain. He never became a Nazi, never joined the party, and sometimes referred to Hitler as the Bohemian Corporal, but like most officers of his caste, he believed the army existed above politics and served the state regardless of who controlled it. Thus, when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, von Rundstedt commanded Army Group South with brilliance, achieving sweeping encirclements that crushed organized Polish resistance in 35 days. In 1940, he oversaw the legendary Ardennes breakthrough that led to France's sudden collapse. In 1941, he commanded Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union, capturing Kiev in one of the largest encirclements in history, but also witnessing something the Nazi ideologues refused to acknowledge. The Red Army, though battered, would not break. By December 1941, he ordered a withdrawal from Rostov against Hitler's orders and was promptly relieved. Yet Germany needed him. In 1942, he was recalled as Commander-in-Chief West, responsible for defending 3,000 miles of coastline with understrength divisions, inadequate armor, dwindling air support, unreliable foreign conscripts, and no possibility of reinforcement. He knew the mathematics, knew that Germany could not defend everywhere, and believed panzer reserves must be held deep inland for a decisive counterstroke. But Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, having seen what Allied air power could do in North Africa, insisted the only chance was to crush the invasion at the beaches before Allied air and naval supremacy made movement impossible. Both men were right in different ways, but Hitler imposed the worst possible compromise, keeping direct control of key panzer divisions so they could not move without his explicit authorization. Thus, on June 6, 1944, D-Day, while 156,000 Allied troops stormed 5 beaches under the protection of 11,000 aircraft and 7,000 ships, von Rundstedt urgently requested release of the panzer reserves. But Hitler was asleep at the Berghof, his staff too afraid to wake him, and hours passed as Allied forces secured their beachheads. When Hitler finally awoke near noon, he convinced himself Normandy was a diversion and the real invasion would come at Calais, a belief reinforced by Allied deception operations. Only late in the afternoon did he authorize movement, but by daylight the panzers were massacred by Allied fighter bombers, and the one armored division close enough to counterattack achieved only temporary, unsupported gains before withdrawing with heavy losses. The decisive moment had passed, exactly as Rommel feared. In the days that followed, Allied strength grew relentlessly while German forces shrank. Rail lines were destroyed, reinforcements arrived too slowly, panzer divisions were ground down in static defensive battles around Caen, the French resistance intensified sabotage, and the Western Front became a slow, bleeding death. On June 17, Rommel and von Rundstedt met Hitler at Margeval in a bunker built for a never-executed invasion of Britain. Hitler, trembling and pale, later understood to be symptoms of Parkinson's, listened as Rommel delivered a brutally honest assessment. The front was barely holding, casualties were unsustainable, Allied air dominance paralyzed movement, and unless political steps were taken, total defeat was certain. Hitler exploded, proclaiming that wonder weapons, the V-1, V-2, and jet aircraft, would reverse the tide, and demanding the army hold every inch of ground. Von Rundstedt said little. He already knew reason could not penetrate Hitler's delusions. A second meeting on June 29 at the Berghof ended the same way, except this time von Rundstedt spoke with unprecedented bluntness. The war in the West was lost, and prolonging it would only destroy Germany further. Hitler denounced him as defeatist. 2 days later came Keitel's phone call, and von Rundstedt's legendary reply, the most honest words spoken within the German High Command in the final year of the war. He was dismissed on July 2. Rommel, meanwhile, grew increasingly convinced that Germany must negotiate before total ruin, and was soon implicated in the July 20 plot to kill Hitler. Though evidence of his involvement was mixed, his popularity made public trial impossible. Instead, on October 14, 1944, Generals Bergdorf and Mazel arrived at his home with poison, offering him a choice between suicide and a show trial that would lead to execution and reprisals against his family. Rommel chose the cyanide capsule, dying at 52, buried as a hero by a regime he no longer believed in. His successor, von Kluge, fared no better. Accused of attempting to negotiate with the Allies, he too took cyanide in August 1944. Thus, one by one, every man who saw the truth, and dared to speak it, was removed, disgraced, or dead. Meanwhile, Germany's collapse accelerated exactly as von Rundstedt had warned. Paris fell on August 25, Belgium and the Netherlands were liberated, the Allies reached the German border by September, the Western Front lost over 400,000 men after D-Day, and in the East, Soviet Operation Bagration annihilated Army Group Center, driving 400 miles in 2 months. Yet, astonishingly, Hitler recalled von Rundstedt in September 1944 because there was no one else left to command. The old field marshal returned, knowing he could not change the outcome. In December, Hitler launched the Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble von Rundstedt opposed as militarily impossible due to lack of fuel, air support, and reserves. The offensive achieved initial surprise but stalled, ran out of fuel, was smashed once Allied aircraft returned to the skies, and cost Germany 100,000 casualties and 800 tanks, its last reserves. After the failure, Only retreat remained. In March 1945, when American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, giving the Allies their first bridgehead across the Rhine, Hitler blamed von Rundstedt and dismissed him again. He returned home, exhausted, ill, and 69 years old, his career over. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hitler had shot himself in his bunker on April 30th, and the Reich he claimed would last 1,000 years had ended in 12. Captured by American forces, von Rundstedt was later charged with war crimes for passing along Hitler's commando order, which resulted in the execution of Allied prisoners, but his deteriorating health prevented trial, and he was released in 1949. He spent his remaining years quietly near Celle, refusing to write memoirs, rarely discussing Hitler, and offering historians only analytical, unemotional commentary, never introspection. He died on February 24, 1953, age 77, buried under a simple stone that lists his name, rank, and dates, nothing more. Historians still debate who von Rundstedt was, a brilliant but morally passive soldier who served a criminal regime without resistance, or a tragic figure trapped in a system that punished moral independence. Perhaps he was both, a professional of immense skill, a man who saw clearly but acted only within the narrow confines of obedience, a commander who recognized truth earlier than nearly anyone around him but lacked either the will or the worldview to oppose the regime he served. What is undeniable is that von Rundstedt recognized the reality of Germany's defeat by July 1, 1944, and said so with clarity unmatched among Hitler's senior officers. His dismissal exemplifies a deeper truth about how organizations collapse when truth becomes a liability. Hitler's Germany was a system optimized for comforting lies, where bad news was softened or suppressed, where officers who reported reality were replaced by those who echoed Hitler's fantasies, and where decision-making drifted farther and farther from the facts until catastrophe became unavoidable. Von Rundstedt's bitter words, "End the war, you idiots," were not just military advice. They were an indictment of the regime's self-destructive refusal to confront reality. Germany ignored him, and burned for 10 more months because of it. The ruins of 1945 stand as the ultimate consequence of silencing truth and elevating delusion. If you found this story compelling, we invite you to like the video, subscribe for more forgotten histories of the Second World War, and comment where you're watching from. Our community spans generations and continents, from veterans to scholars to students of history, all keeping these stories alive.